Exercise set 1.1, Distinguishing Premises from Conclusions. This is from a workbook for arguments by Morrow and Weston. So the objective of today's exercise is to give you practice distinguishing premises from conclusions in other people's arguments. Distinguishing premises from conclusions is sometimes more of an art than a science. We'd all be better off if people were always clear about the premises and conclusions of their arguments, but that's just not really how things work. So, learning to distinguish premises from conclusions is important, and it's the kind of thing that takes a little bit of practice, as we're going to see. So, the first strategy is to ask yourself what the author of the argument that you're considering is trying to convince you to believe. The claim that the author is trying to get you to believe is the argument's conclusion. Then, you can ask what reasons the author gives to try to convince you of this conclusion. These reasons will be the argument's premises. The second strategy for distinguishing premises from conclusions is to look for indicator words. Some words or phrases are conclusion indicators, and these are words or phrases that'll tell you that you're about to read or hear the conclusion of an argument. Other words or phrases are premise indicators. These tell you that you're about to read or hear a premise. So here's a few conclusion indicator words. Therefore, thus, hence, so, consequently, this shows that. So these are words that would indicate a conclusion. Here's the premise indicator words. Because, since, given that, for, on the grounds that, and this follows from. So these are words that might indicate a premise. So here's a couple more pieces of advice as we move forward. First, don't rely solely on indicator words. Some arguments will not use any indicator words at all, and others are going to use the indicator words in other ways. Some words, like because, since, and so, have many other uses, and not every use of because indicates that you're about to hear a premise. When in doubt, fall back on the first strategy. Ask yourself whether the author is giving you a reason for the conclusion. If your answer is no, you haven't found a premise, even if the sentence includes because or since. A second piece of advice: don't assume that everything in a passage is either a premise or a conclusion. So this is a little bit tricky to sort of navigate at first, but as we're going to see, there's often a lot of extra things included in the passages that we look at. Not all of the passages contain arguments. Some passages are telling stories, describing things, giving explanations, issuing commands, making jokes, or doing other things beside giving reasons for a conclusion. Even in passages that do contain arguments, some sentences or clauses are going to provide background information, make side comments, and so on. Again, the key is to ask yourself, is this sentence stating a conclusion or giving me a reason to believe that conclusion? If it's doing either of these two things, it's part of the argument. And if it's not, then it's not part of the argument. All right, so let's look at a sample argument. In order to prosper, a democracy needs its citizens to be able to carry out their responsibilities competently. Being a competent citizen requires familiarity with the basics of math, natural science, social science, history, and literature, as well as the ability to read and write well, and the ability to think critically. A liberal education is essential to developing these skills. Therefore, in order for a democracy to prosper, its citizens must get a liberal education. All right. So, if we go towards identifying the conclusion and the premises, I have underlined the conclusion there at the end. In order for a democracy to prosper, its citizens must get a liberal education. And I've put brackets around what I've identified as the premises. So the first premise: in order to prosper, a democracy needs its citizens to be able to carry out their responsibilities competently. The second premise: Being a competent citizen requires familiarity with the basics of math, natural science, social science, history, and literature, as well as the ability to read and write well, and the ability to think critically. And then the final premise, a liberal education is essential to developing these skills. And so then we see the conclusion. Therefore, in order for a democracy to prosper, its citizens must get a liberal education. In this sample problem, the last sentence is the conclusion, and each of the first three sentences is a separate premise. However, remember that many passages contain sentences or parts of sentences that are neither premises nor conclusions. In this exercise, you don't need to bracket or underline those parts of the sentence. So here there's a couple, therefore it looks like mostly. I'm a little bit less concerned about this. If you can get in the neighborhood of the premises and the neighborhood of the conclusion, that's pretty good to start. All right, let's look at the first odd question from the book. Racial segregation reduces some persons to the status of things. Hence, segregation is morally wrong. All right, so I'll give you a moment to try to figure out what the conclusion is and what each of the premises are, if there's more than one. Okay, so we see that this is a one-premise argument with a conclusion. Racial segregation reduces some persons to the status of things. And then the conclusion, hence, segregation is morally wrong. The main clue in this argument is the word hence, which is a conclusion indicator. Since hence introduces the clause, segregation is morally wrong, that clause is likely to be the conclusion. Furthermore, it makes sense to see racial segregation reduces some persons to the status of things as a reason for thinking that segregation is morally wrong rather than the other way around, you see? So note that the word hence is not underlined in response. In this response, conclusion indicators point to the conclusion, but they're not part of the conclusion itself. And again, I'm not super particular about this detail. All right, let's look at another example. This is number 3 from the book. Professors shouldn't give their students grades on their assignments because grades create bad incentives and they don't provide useful feedback. All right, take a little while, maybe pause the video, and ask yourself, what's the conclusion and where are the premises? Okay, so the conclusion here, professors shouldn't give their students grades on their assignments, and then the two premises, grades create bad incentives, and they, which here means grades, don't provide useful feedback. So therefore the conclusion, professors shouldn't give their students grades on their assignments. In this argument, the premise and conclusion are part of a single sentence. The premise indicator because is your cue that the last clause is the premise and the first clause is the conclusion. Because is a special indicator word in this respect. It usually comes in between the conclusion and the premise. Thus, it helps you identify both the conclusion and the premise in this example. Notice that this model response treats the second part of the sentence as providing two separate premises. So you could put a bracket around everything and treat it as a single premise. So in this case, grades create bad incentives and they don't provide useful feedback as a single sentence. But notice that when you separate it out into two premises, this makes sense because each premise provides pretty different reasons for the conclusion. Again, in this example, if you treated both premises as a single one, that would be okay. But you can also see this is where it's both an art and a science that it's possible to break it up into two separate premises. Okay, the last example for today, let's look at number 7. Some people buy college degrees on the internet because they're trying to pretend that they went to college. That's a waste of money, since it's easy to make a college degree on your computer, and a degree that you make yourself is just as good as a degree that you bought on the internet. All right, and notice that this is adapted from The Onion, the satirical newspaper. Okay, I'm going to give you a second to ask yourself where the premises are and what the conclusion is. Okay, so here, the conclusion, that's a waste of money. In this case, that's buying a college degree on the internet. And the premises, it's easy to make a college degree on your computer. A degree that you make yourself is just as good as a degree that you bought on the internet. And so therefore, buying a degree on the internet is a waste of money. So the only genuine indicator word in this argument is the premise indicator, sense. That's your clue that you're about to see a premise. If you're still having trouble identifying the conclusion after you've found those premises, ask yourself which of the remaining sentences the premises would be good reasons for. In this case, it makes sense to take the premises as reasons to think that buying a college degree online is a waste of money. It doesn't make sense to take the premises as reasons to think that people do buy college degrees online. Thus, we can mark that's a waste of money as the conclusion of the argument. Notice that we have marked the last two clauses as separate premises. You could also have marked everything after sense as one long premise, but in general, it's better to treat each independent clause as its own premise. So this is kind of related to the previous example, right? So we remember that when the ideas can be broken up into two separate sets of things, generally speaking, it's a good idea to list them as separate premises. All right, so this is an overview of how to identify premises and conclusions and a few of the exercises. The assignment for this is going to be the even exercises, which you'll find in the assignment.